Welcome. My name is Dr. Terry Loftus, and today we're going to be talking about building a case for reprocessed medical devices. This is part one of a two-part series. Part one is going to go into a study that was published in the Journal of Medical Devices in December of 2015. And that study looked at reprocessed devices, specifically compared original equipment manufacturers, also known as OEM, versus reprocessed devices, or RP for short. And what we did was wanted to know what was the defect rate between those. So the first part is going to go into a lot of detail regarding that study. The second study, on the other hand, or excuse me, the second part of this course is going to go into specifically, why did that happen and what's the consequences of it. So stay tuned. Here we go. So why reprocessed devices? Well, probably the number one reason is lower cost. If you look at reprocessed devices, particularly in this series, what we looked at was energy devices. And the lower cost means that we're talking about upwards of 50% savings for healthcare organizations who are purchasing these types of devices. It also reduces the amount of hazardous waste, and it also diverts waste from landfills. Remember, these devices are frequently used on patients and will get contaminated during the process of an operation. So that creates hazardous waste. Hazardous waste costs more to dispose of. And so cutting that waste down is a good way to reduce costs. It also diverts waste from landfills. If you think about it, typically for energy devices, in fact, it's about a one-to-one transition. So what happens is that you need one OEM device to create a one reprocessed device. So that's about a 50% reprocessing rate if you were doing that completely full, the site or completed through the cycle. So the important thing to remember is that you can literally cut your waste down about 50% just by doing this type of process. So what are the device concerns, though, and particularly with regards to reprocess? I think by far and away the one that I ran into the most with talking to surgeons was function. They just were not convinced that the reprocessed devices function in the same way that a device that was original equipment manufactured, that single-use device. The other one was concerns around contamination. Some of you might remember back in the 90s and early 2000s, there was some pretty heavy campaigning on the part of the OEMs out there, the manufacturers of these devices, and they were demonstrating that there was a soilage occurring at the microscopic level in these devices, and that was potential contamination and therefore an infectious risk for patients. There was also potential for litigation. I just, out of curiosity, I searched this the other day and put in medical device and litigation and found 895,000 search results. As you can imagine, most of them are attorneys looking for people who were interested in suing doctors, vendors, and healthcare organizations regarding medical devices. So there are some genuine concerns there. Most of these currently have to do with surgical mesh and implants, but I guess there's always the possibility that other types of devices can be included as well. Patient charges is another big one. Physicians in particular wanted to know that if hospitals were getting a 50% off for the reprocessed devices, were they passing those savings on to patients? And in some cases, they just weren't, because reprocessed devices were getting charged the same way an OEM device was. I think most inventory systems now separate out the two and will therefore pass along the savings. But most billing that occurs in healthcare organizations now are on a DRG basis, so hospitals really aren't passing on anything. They get paid the same amount regardless of whether they get a savings on it or not. So I think that argument's probably less and less. But the one that probably concerns surgeons the most is, are we trading cost savings for patient safety? That is there a patient safety issue going on here with regards to reprocessed device? And therefore we're getting some cost savings, but there may be some trade-off here, and it's the patient who's ultimately ended up paying for this. And that's probably the number one concern. So how do we resolve this? At the time I worked for Banner Health, was Medical Director of Surgical Services. I was also had oversight on Surgical Clinical Consensus Group, and I was the co-lead for that group. And we brought it to our group. We didn't have a value analysis program at the time. We later created a value analysis program, but this one was really more focused on looking at clinical practices for the system. It was a function of under our Division of Care Management. It was a multidisciplinary system group made up of physicians, nurses, people from quality, people from administration, who looked at clinical practices for the system. And that was primarily what its responsibility was. we decided that this is probably a good place to have a discussion. Like I said, we didn't have a value analysis program, so we figured this is a good enough audience to bring it in front of. So we brought in one of the vendors and who had a surgeon who was presenting for the reprocessing company. And needless to say, it was quite a contentious discussion. In fact, actually very contentious. And we really couldn't, it was difficult to get consensus on anything. We did agree that the infection risk probably was not greater with reprocess. I think everyone could pretty much agree on that. There was no consensus agreement on the functional comparison of OEM versus reprocessing. The surgeons were convinced that the functioning of reprocessed devices, particularly energy devices, was worse than that of the OEM. Now, what's interesting is the reprocessing company didn't think that they had a superior functioning. They just felt that it was substantially equivalent, which is really what the FDA sets for them, meaning they have to demonstrate functional equivalence for their FDA approval. Well, we really couldn't come to any agreement on this. And so one of our department chairs put his hand up and he said, hey, we're a big organization. We collect a lot of data. Why don't we just collect data on this and take a look at it? So we did. We said, all right, we'll go. All right, actually, I agreed to it. I said, sure, that sounds simple enough. I'll go out and do it. Well, as it turns out, it wasn't simple enough. First place I went to was Department of Surgery. I wanted to know what were the departments doing. Were they collecting any data on this? And it turned out they weren't. They weren't collecting any data at all. So I went to our perioperative discipline team. This team is the perioperative directors for the entire organization who met on a monthly basis and asked them. I said, no data. We don't look at this stuff. Go talk to the people in quality. It sounds like a quality issue. So I talked to the people in quality, and they said, no data on this. We aren't collecting data on this, but it sounds like it's a patient safety concern. Go down the hall here and talk to people in patient safety. And I went down there and no data. So we're a large organization. We collect a lot of data. And we also built an enterprise data warehouse, which was basically taking data from all the silos, putting it into one sort of data warehouse. And that way it allowed for single searching to find answers like this type of question. So I went to our data people and they said, sure, if it's there, we'll find it. No problem. They called me back about 2 weeks later and said, we've been looking all over. We cannot find it. There is no data. We have no data on this whatsoever. And I was getting a little discouraged. Around this time, I made a transition over to corporate headquarters and became medical director of surgical services and clinical resources. And the clinical resources part of it was working on dyad function with our VP of supply chain services. And so I got an insight into a lot of what was happening in supply chain and happened to be at a meeting and lamenting this. And sure enough, somebody says, well, what kind of data do you need? And I said, well, I'd like to know how many of these devices we're purchasing, both OEM and reprocessing. And this woman looks up at me and says, I think I can get that. I said, great. Could you get that for me? She said, yeah. I said, how about defective OEM and reprocessed devices? Oh, no, I don't do that. I don't collect that data. I said, oh, okay. I go to another meeting, having the same discussion. Another person looks up at me and says, well, I collect that data. And I said, you do? She said, yeah. She goes, I don't call it defective, though. She goes, we mainly track it because if a device is not working in the way that it's supposed to be working and it's handed off during the time of an operation, we track that because we don't want to get double billed for it. We don't want the manufacturer coming back and sending us another bill for that new device that we had to replace it with. So we keep track of it. And they had a log of this. And I said, well, where is it? She said, it's on my laptop. So there was data out there. It just wasn't in the place I was used to looking for it. And so that's how we came up with the definition. We want to know what was defined as any time a member of the surgical team, surgeon, scrub tech, first assistant, or circulating nurse, determined that the bipolar and ultrasound diathermy devices, which is the energy devices that we used in this study, was not functioning in a manner consistent with the device's intended purposes. And that's how we started. Not the greatest way to think about it, but because you would think we would be able to collect that type of data in advance, knowing that that's what we're looking for, but we didn't at the time, and we didn't even know that we had data that could give us the answer to this. So the methods are, it was a retrospective study, and the only reason why we chose a 7-month period is because those conversations I just told you with supply chain occurred in August and September of 2013. And I said, yeah, can you get something from the previous, from the beginning of the year? And they said, yeah, we'll give you the 7-month period. That's how I got the data. And we looked at 2 types of bipolar and ultrasound diathermy devices. They're primarily used for vessel sealing and dividing in open and laparoscopic surgical procedures. And the energy devices we looked at, for the OEM, it was the Ethicon Harmonic. It's a single-use ultrasound diathermy device, Covidien ligature, single-use bipolar device. And then for reprocessed, we contracted with Stryker Sustainability Solutions. And so we looked at the Ethicon Harmonic that was reprocessed and the Covidien ligature that was reprocessed, and that's how we used our comparison. And we looked at the defect rate, as I previously stated in the other slide, as to how we were going to do that, check for defects. So here's our results, and what you can see is we had a little over 3,000 purchases, and you can see about 35 defects at that time. And the defect rate is a statistically significant difference between OEM and reprocess. So the OEM rate was around 2%, reprocess rate was around 0.4%. That's roughly, as you'll see, it's 4.9 times greater for OEM, statistically significant. When we broke it out based on the device maker, what we found was the harmonic OEM and reprocess was also statistically significant difference, and then the ligature was also statistically significant difference. So it didn't matter which manufacturer, there was a statistical difference between those two. So here's our rates. It's just another way of looking at it for the chart representation of the results, and you can see it's about a 4.9 times greater defect rate. When we looked at harmonic energy devices, roughly 6 times greater defect rate. And then for the ligature, we found that the defect rates were only about 4 times greater. And remember that 4 and 6 difference isn't statistically significant. It was only when we combined the results and looked at it and realized that that there are statistically significant differences. And what I mean by that is they are statistically significant in terms of compared to reprocess, but we're not compared to each other. I think I've got a chart that looks at that as well. So we looked at those results, and it's harmonic versus ligature. It's 1.76% defect rate versus 2.24, not statistically significant. And then when we looked at it for reprocessing, 0.29% versus 0.59%, not statistically significant. So the issue is not comparing harmonic versus ligature. The issue is OEM versus reprocessing. So there's some limitations of the study. It's retrospective in design, so it suffers from all of the potential pitfalls of a retrospective study. Lack of data on why the devices were defective. Remember, we were tracking it for cost purposes. We didn't want to get double charged for the devices. We weren't specifically looking at why the devices were being handed off by the teams. There's also a problem reporting versus purchasing periods. So you can purchase something prior to a reporting period, and then it fails, or you can purchase it during a reporting period, but it isn't used until the period after that ends. So technically, that can confuse the results. There's a potential for that. And probably the most important thing is we didn't clinically track this, meaning we didn't look at encounter level detail on clinical outcomes, comparing those between the devices. We had no results on that. We didn't have any way of tracking it. I do think that UDI, unique device ID information, will be helpful in the future, but it'll be interesting to see what that will look like when we start having that data, because that'll be very helpful for us. So our conclusions were OEM energy devices were defective 4.9 times more frequently than similar reprocessed devices. The defect rate for OEM energy devices was 2%. And was not significantly different based on brand. And the conclusions were the opposite predicted by the surgeons and the vendors, both the OEM and reprocessed vendors. Remember, surgeons said it was going to be OEM was going to be worse. The OEM said surgeons said that reprocessing was going to be worse. It'd have a worse defect rate. The OEM said yes, the reprocessing will have a worse defect rate. And the reprocessing company said no, it will not be worse. It'll be equivalent. So they weren't even ready to go so far as to say that it might be superior, which is getting back to some things with regards to how the FDA defines it. So it's kind of an interesting observation. So if you have any questions, you can always send an email to me at terryloftusmd@gmail.com, or you can go check my website at www.loftushealth.com. In part 2, we're going to go into why some of these things happen and hopefully help understand why that's an important issue. And thank you very much, and please go on to part number 2 and see more information.